When my great-aunt revealed her final will, my father's rage boiled over and wanted to take everything from me, but the court found him guilty and he got nothing. I never expected to inherit anything from my great-aunt Helen. She was that enigmatic, fierce woman in our family. Never married, no kids, and a strict believer in living life on her own terms, as she often told me. Growing up, she was the eccentric figure everyone had mixed feelings about. But I liked her. She seemed to appreciate me in a way that didn't feel laced with expectations or judgments. Looking back, I realized that might have been her way of showing she trusted me. So when I got a call from her lawyer after she passed, saying I needed to attend the reading of her will, I was surprised. My dad, Aaron, didn't even seem to want me to go. "It's just a formality," he muttered when I mentioned it. Helen was always unpredictable. Don't count on much. Maybe he was right, but I wanted to honor her. So there I was, sitting in a stuffy office in a building that looked like it had been around since Helen was a kid. Dad was there too, looking irritated as if he'd rather be anywhere else. It struck me that he hadn't been around much during Aunt Helen's last few months, while I'd visited her every chance I got. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe he was just annoyed that he had to share the space with me. The lawyer cleared his throat and got right down to business. It was almost surreal, listening to the list of her assets being read out loud. Aunt Helen had saved a lot more than I'd realized. A small fortune in stocks, an antique collection, and a sprawling house on the edge of town. But it wasn't just the quantity that surprised me. It was the quality. Helen had taken great care of what she owned, almost as if she'd known she'd be leaving it behind for someone. And that someone, it turned out, was me. I could feel my dad's eyes burning into me as the lawyer continued. My heart pounded as the lawyer listed me as the main beneficiary of Helen's estate, including her house, her investments, and a separate savings fund. When the lawyer concluded, I could feel the weight of the room shift. There was a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of my father's sharp inhale. "You're giving what to him?" Dad's voice cut through the air, harsh and incredulous. I looked over at him, confused and slightly alarmed. This wasn't the reaction I'd expected. Anger, maybe, but not this level of fury. The lawyer looked at him calmly. "Mr. Aaron, your aunt's wishes were clear. Lucas is her primary beneficiary." Dad's face was turning red. I'd seen him angry before, but never like this. This is absurd. She was my aunt. He barely even knew her. I felt like I'd been punched. "Dad, that's not true. I spent a lot of time with her." "Oh, sure. A few weekends here and there," he snapped. "What did you think? That you just cozy up to her and walk away with everything?" I was stunned. It felt like a slap in the face to hear him talk to me like that. I didn't do anything to influence her decision. I didn't even know she was leaving me anything. "Well, congratulations, Lucas," he said bitterly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've played your cards right. I hope you're happy." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but I was too shocked. I'd always known Dad and Aunt Helen had a complicated relationship. There were whispers of past disagreements and stories about how Helen had cut him out of her life at one point, though they'd managed to reconcile. Now, I wondered if they'd ever truly mended things. The lawyer handed me a folder. "Lucas, this is all yours now. You have some decisions to make about the estate, of course, but there's no rush. Take your time to process things." I nodded, my mind spinning. Part of me felt a strange gratitude, knowing Aunt Helen had trusted me with her legacy. But I also felt a sharp pang of guilt, like I was somehow betraying my dad just by accepting her gift. As we left the office, my dad stayed silent until we got to the parking lot. Then he turned to me, his eyes blazing with an intensity I'd never seen before. "You don't deserve this," he spat. "You're just a kid. What the hell are you going to do with all that money, all that property?" "Dad," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "I didn't ask for this. I didn't even know she was leaving me anything." "That's exactly the problem," he shouted. "You didn't earn this. You didn't do anything to deserve it." "Maybe Aunt Helen saw something in me that she wanted to leave behind," I replied, trying to keep my cool. I wasn't even sure where the words were coming from. Maybe I was tired of always feeling like I had to prove myself to him. And maybe this is what she wanted. His expression twisted. This isn't over, Lucas. Don't think for a second that this is over. I watched him storm off to his car, and as he drove away, I felt a sense of dread settle over me. I'd expected this to be awkward, but not to the level of open hostility. I'd seen glimpses of my dad's resentment in the past, but I'd brushed them aside, chalking it up to stress or our usual father-son tension. Now, though, I wasn't so sure. Something felt deeply wrong, like this inheritance had unearthed an ugly side of him I hadn't fully seen before. I stood there, clutching the folder, staring at the empty space where his car had been, wondering what would happen next. As I got in my own car, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had just taken a very unexpected turn. Aunt Helen's gift was a blessing, but it felt like it had come with a curse attached. I didn't know how my dad planned to make this right in his eyes, but I had a feeling he wasn't going to go quietly. With a heavy heart, I drove home, the weight of the inheritance pressing down on me in a way I never could have anticipated. The thought of the house, the money, and the legacy Aunt Helen had left was daunting. Yet, deep down, I felt a flicker of determination. If she trusted me with all this, maybe it was time I started believing in myself too. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find a way to honor her wishes, even if it meant standing up to my own father. I didn't hear from my dad for almost a week after the will reading. I thought he might be cooling off, maybe trying to come to terms with everything. But then he showed up at my apartment one evening, his face tight with anger. I barely got the door open before he pushed past me, storming into my living room without so much as a hello. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and strained. I closed the door, my pulse quickening. "Okay, what's this about?" He turned to face me, and I could see it, rage simmering just beneath the surface. "You know exactly what this is about, Lucas. That money. That property. You can't seriously think you're keeping all of it." I felt my chest tighten. "Dad, this isn't about keeping or taking. Aunt Helen left it to me. It was her choice." He scoffed, crossing his arms. "Her choice?" Helen was always eccentric, always had her little favorites. She didn't understand what that money could do for me. "I've got debts, real responsibilities, your future to think about." It hit me then. He wasn't here for me. He was here for himself. "You're not concerned about my future, Dad. You're just mad that she didn't leave it to you." He narrowed his eyes. "Don't get smart with me, Lucas. I worked my entire life. Our entire family worked to keep things running smoothly, and she just hands it all over to you." I took a breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe she saw that I wouldn't let it change me. Maybe she saw something in me that she trusted. He shook his head, his laugh dry and humorless. "Trust? Don't make me laugh. She barely knew you. You're a kid with no experience, no idea what you're doing. Look, Dad, I get that this is a shock, but it's done. There's nothing we can do to change her decision." "Oh, there's something I can do, all right." His tone was cold, calculated, and it sent a chill through me. "I talked to my lawyer. This isn't over, not by a long shot. Helen was obviously out of her mind, and I'm going to make sure that what gets contested." I stared at him, unable to believe he'd go that far. "You can't be serious. That's like accusing me of manipulating her." "Didn't you?" He shot back, his words laced with accusation. "Didn't you cozy up to her, go see her every weekend, tell her stories, make her laugh? You knew she was old, that she was lonely. You took advantage of that, didn't you?" I felt my stomach turn. "That's not what happened. I was just spending time with her because I cared about her. I never expected anything from her." He gave me a bitter look. "Well, congratulations, Lucas. You got exactly what you wanted, didn't you?" I couldn't listen to him anymore. The anger, the jealousy, it was pouring out of him like poison. "Dad, just stop. This isn't going to change anything. Aunt Helen's gone. She left her wishes behind. You can't rewrite that just because you don't like it." He took a step closer, his face inches from mine. "You think you're better than me, don't you? With all that money in your lap, you think you're suddenly above me?" I could feel my heart pounding, my hands clenched at my sides. "No, I don't think that. I've never thought that. I just want to respect her wishes. Why can't you respect that?" "Respect?" he snarled. You don't know the first thing about respect. I built this family. I worked every day of my life to make sure you had everything you needed. And you think I'm going to just stand by while you take what's rightfully mine?" The weight of his words sank in, twisting something inside me. He wasn't here for understanding. He was here to claim what he thought belonged to him, regardless of Aunt Helen's wishes or the relationship I'd shared with her. He turned, heading for the door, but stopped and looked back at me. "If you don't do the right thing, Lucas, if you don't hand over what she left you, I'm going to make sure you regret it." I swallowed hard, a bitter taste in my mouth. "Threatening me isn't going to change anything, Dad." "Oh, it's not a threat. It's a promise." With that, he slammed the door behind him, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe how quickly things had spiraled. Just days ago, I'd thought my dad and I might actually work through this, maybe even find some common ground. But now it felt like he'd crossed a line that I wasn't sure he could ever come back from. In the days that followed, I tried to focus on my work, to stay busy and keep my mind off the whole mess. But it was impossible. Every time my phone rang, every email notification, every knock at the door, my stomach clenched, expecting some new fallout from Dad's threat. Then, one afternoon, I received an email from a law firm I didn't recognize. I opened it, skimming through the legal jargon, and felt my stomach drop. My dad had actually done it. He'd filed a formal contest against Aunt Helen's will, claiming she'd been influenced and manipulated by me in her final months. He was accusing me of taking advantage of her age, her loneliness, and her supposed lack of mental capacity. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. I hadn't done any of those things, and the idea that he would drag Helen's name through the mud just to get what he wanted, it made me sick. But I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I'd have to fight this, or he'd end up taking everything she'd wanted me to have. I called the lawyer Aunt Helen had used, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel who'd handled her affairs for years. She was calm, professional, but I could sense a hint of anger in her voice when I explained the situation. "I suspected something like this might happen," Rachel said. "Your father and your aunt, they had a long history of disagreements over money. Helen made it clear to me that she wanted you to inherit her estate, and she took specific legal steps to ensure her wishes were honored." I felt a surge of relief. "So, he doesn't have a case, right?" "Not an easy one, no," she assured me. "But he's banking on the idea that you'll be too intimidated to fight him. I've seen it happen before. He'll drag you through the mud, make all kinds of accusations, hoping you'll give up and give in. But if you're willing to fight, Lucas, I think we can put a stop to this." I didn't hesitate. "I want to fight. I want to honor Aunt Helen's wishes." She sighed, as if bracing herself. "All right then. I'll start preparing our case. But just know, these things can get messy. Your father isn't likely to back down, and he'll probably bring up things that could make this very personal." I thanked her, feeling a strange mix of dread and determination. I hadn't asked for this fight, but there was no way I was going to let Dad's bitterness overshadow everything Aunt Helen had left behind. She trusted me for a reason, and I wasn't going to betray that trust. Over the next few days, as we began preparing for the legal battle ahead, I found myself questioning everything. Was I really ready for this? Could I handle going up against my own father in court, hearing him accuse me of manipulating Helen, watching him try to twist our relationship into something ugly? And worst of all, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that maybe he'd been right about one thing, that this inheritance was changing everything. I'd wanted to keep peace in our family, to avoid a battle, but now that seemed impossible. Aunt Helen had left me her legacy, but in doing so, she'd uncovered a side of my father that I wasn't sure I'd ever seen before. As I lay awake at night, I kept coming back to a single thought. This fight wasn't just about money or property. It was about something deeper, about respect, loyalty, and honoring the people who'd shaped us. And no matter how hard it got, I was determined to see it through. The weeks leading up to the court date were some of the hardest of my life. My dad's accusations had driven a wedge between us, but the legal battle felt like it was splitting our entire family apart. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years started popping up, some sympathetic and others suspicious, asking all kinds of questions about Aunt Helen's will. Everyone had an opinion, and most of them weren't afraid to share it. Dad, of course, was relentless. His lawyer had submitted statements from people who claimed Aunt Helen had been forgetful and erratic in her final months, painting a picture of a frail, easily influenced woman. An image I knew couldn't be further from the truth. The real Helen had been sharp as a tack, right up to the end, but it didn't matter. Dad's strategy was clear. Make me look like I'd taken advantage of an old woman, hoping that would be enough to get the will overturned. As the hearing approached, I found myself doubting everything. Could I really do this? Could I go through with tearing down my father's arguments in court, knowing how ugly it would get? Every time I thought about it, I felt like I was betraying some fundamental family loyalty, even though I knew Aunt Helen's wishes were at stake. It didn't help that, out of the blue, I got a call from my mom. She and Dad had divorced years ago, and she'd mostly stayed out of my life since. But now, all of a sudden, she seemed very interested in what was going on. "Lucas, honey," she said, her voice sticky sweet, the way it always got when she wanted something. "I heard about the inheritance. I just want you to know, I think you're doing the right thing by contesting your father. You know he's always been, well, a bit money-hungry." I gritted my teeth, sensing an ulterior motive. "Mom, I didn't reach out to you because I didn't want this to turn into a family spectacle." "Oh, I know. It's just, well, Helen and I were friends once, you know, back in the day, before she and your father had their falling out. I just want to make sure you're okay, Lucas." I didn't believe her for a second, but I played along. "I appreciate it, Mom, but I've got it handled." "Well," she said with a forced chuckle, "if you ever need any insight, just give me a call. I know more about your father than anyone. I'd hate for him to take advantage of you the way he's tried to take advantage of so many people." When she hung up, I felt exhausted. The last thing I needed was my mom fanning the flames just to feel involved. But her words stuck with me. Had Dad really manipulated people like this before? I'd always thought of him as a strict, sometimes overbearing father, but this whole ordeal was starting to paint him in a new light. Maybe Mom was right about him. A few days later, I got a call from someone I didn't expect at all. Aunt Helen's best friend, Carol. Carol was in her 70s, a warm, kind woman who'd been like a second aunt to me growing up. I hadn't seen her in a while, but she sounded as sharp as ever. "Lucas, I heard about what your father's doing, and I couldn't just stand by without saying something," she said, her voice full of resolve. "Carol, it's complicated," I replied, not wanting to drag her into the mess. Complicated or not, I think Helen would be furious if she knew what Aaron was trying to pull. She trusted you, Lucas. She always did. And she made that choice for a reason. I felt a lump in my throat. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, Carol. I don't want to hurt my dad, but this whole thing, it's tearing me up." She sighed, and I could hear the sympathy in her voice. "Lucas, sometimes doing the right thing means standing up to people, even the ones we love. Helen and Aaron. They had their battles over the years, but she saw something in you. She believed in you. You've got to believe in yourself enough to see this through." We talked a while longer, with Carol sharing stories about Helen, stories that reminded me of the woman she truly was, strong, independent, and fiercely protective of her loved ones. By the time I hung up, I felt more grounded. Carol's words had given me the confidence to move forward. The day of the hearing arrived, and I walked into the courthouse with a mixture of dread and determination. My lawyer, Rachel, had prepared me as best as she could, but nothing could have braced me for the sight of my dad sitting across the room, staring at me with an expression of contempt. When the judge called us forward, Dad's lawyer went straight into his argument, painting a picture of Aunt Helen as a vulnerable, confused woman who'd been manipulated in her last months. He even hinted that I'd encouraged her to isolate from the rest of the family so I could sway her decisions. It was painful to sit through, and more than once I had to bite my lip to keep from shouting out. Then it was my turn. Rachel spoke with a calm confidence, dismantling each of Dad's accusations, point by point. She presented records of my visits to Aunt Helen. Regular, yes, but hardly excessive. She showed documents proving Helen's sound mind, even a statement from her doctor attesting to her mental clarity in her final year. Finally, she presented a series of letters Helen had written, letters where she detailed her desire to leave her estate to me, citing how much she valued our relationship and trusted me to carry on her legacy. As Rachel read from one of those letters, I could see Dad's face harden. He looked at me like I was a stranger, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I reminded myself of the truth. I hadn't forced Aunt Helen to do anything. I hadn't manipulated her. I'd simply been there for her when others weren't, and she'd made her decision based on that. Then, something unexpected happened. Carol stood up, asking the judge if she could say a few words. She was allowed, and she approached the stand, her head held high. "Helen and I were friends for nearly 50 years, she began, her voice steady. And I can tell you, Helen was nobody's fool. She made her own decisions, always. If she wanted Lucas to have her estate, then she knew exactly why she was doing it." She glanced at Dad, and her gaze was unyielding. "Aaron, you were her nephew, and yes, she loved you. But love isn't entitlement. Lucas was there for her, without expecting anything in return. She trusted him because he earned it, not because he asked for it." The room was silent as Carol finished, and I could see Dad's lawyer scrambling. It was clear they hadn't anticipated someone like Carol stepping up to defend Helen's decision. Her words seemed to shift something in the room, grounding the entire case in the reality of Helen's life and her character. Afterward, the judge called a recess, and as I left the courtroom, I felt a strange sense of calm. No matter what happened next, I knew I'd honored Aunt Helen's wishes, and that was what mattered most. But as I walked down the hallway, I heard my dad calling my name. "Lucas." He caught up to me, his face a mix of anger and something that almost looked like desperation. "Why are you doing this to me?" I looked him in the eyes, trying to find the father I'd grown up with, the man who'd once taught me how to throw a baseball, who'd shown up at every one of my games, who'd been there through every scraped knee and sleepless night. But all I saw was bitterness, resentment, and entitlement. "I'm not doing anything to you, Dad," I said quietly. "Aunt Helen made her choice, and I'm honoring it. That's all." His expression twisted. "She was manipulated, Lucas. She would never have done this if you hadn't put ideas in her head." "I didn't put ideas in her head, Dad. I was just there. She was lonely, and I cared about her. That's it." He looked away, jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Maybe it should be," I replied, feeling a sadness settle over me. "Maybe it's time to let go." He didn't respond, just turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched in defeat. As I watched him go, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. This whole ordeal had shown me sides of my father I wished I hadn't seen, but it had also given me a new sense of clarity. As I walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the inheritance no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a gift, a final act of trust from Aunt Helen, a reminder that sometimes the people who believe in us see things we can't even see in ourselves. I barely slept the night before the final hearing. The back and forth with my father, the courtroom tension, the testimonies, it all weighed on me like a storm gathering strength. By the time I entered the courthouse, I felt like I'd aged 10 years. Rachel, my lawyer, looked sharp and prepared as always, but I could tell even she was on edge. She'd warned me that Dad might pull some last-minute surprises, desperate to sway the court in his favor. I could only hope we were prepared for whatever he had planned. The hearing began with my father's lawyer presenting his final arguments. He painted a picture of Aunt Helen as an isolated, vulnerable woman, suggesting that I'd taken advantage of her affection and trust. It was almost laughable, the way he twisted our relationship, but the lies stung all the same. Hearing myself described that way, as a manipulator, a schemer, left me feeling hollow. Then, my father took the stand. I braced myself, knowing this would be the hardest part. He was my dad, the man who'd raised me, and yet here he was, testifying against me in an attempt to disinherit me. The sight of him sitting there, his face set in a stony glare, made my stomach churn. "Mr. Aaron," his lawyer began, "can you tell the court about your sister Helen and your relationship with her?" Dad nodded, his face somber. "Helen and I were close when we were young, but over the years, things changed. She was always very independent, stubborn even. She didn't like to share or rely on anyone. And how would you describe her mental state in her final years? His lawyer pressed. Dad sighed, a theatrical gesture that made my skin crawl. She was lonely and forgetful. She wasn't the same Helen I knew growing up. She was vulnerable, and I don't think she always made the best choices. His lawyer glanced in my direction, then back at Dad. So, in your opinion, could she have been manipulated into altering her will? Dad's gaze hardened. Yes, I believe she was. My son, Lucas, he visited her regularly. More than I did, I'll admit. He took advantage of her loneliness, and I think he knew exactly what he was doing. I clenched my fists, anger boiling inside me. This was my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, and here he was accusing me of manipulating the one person in our family who truly understood me. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and hurt beyond words. When it was my turn to take the stand, Rachel's voice was calm and reassuring. Lucas, tell us about your relationship with Aunt Helen. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. She was everything to me. Aunt Helen was always there when I needed someone. She listened, she cared, and she understood me in ways that others didn't. I visited her because I wanted to, not because I expected anything in return. She was family. Rachel nodded, giving me an encouraging look. Did you ever ask her to leave you her estate? I shook my head firmly. No, we never even talked about it. It was her decision, and I had no idea she'd left anything to me until the will was read. As I spoke, I glanced at my dad. His face was unreadable, but I could sense his resentment simmering beneath the surface. Part of me wanted to plead with him, to ask him why he was doing this, but I knew it was pointless. This was a side of him I hadn't fully understood until now. Rachel proceeded to dismantle my father's claims, presenting evidence of Aunt Helen's mental clarity and her own documented decisions about her estate. She referenced the letters Helen had written, the doctor's statements, and Carol's powerful testimony from the previous hearing. Piece by piece, she tore apart the idea that Helen had been manipulated or confused in her final years. Then, to my surprise, Rachel called a new witness, an old friend of Aunt Helen's who I hadn't seen in years, a man named Tom. Tom was in his late 60s, and he looked slightly nervous as he took the stand. But when he began speaking, his voice was steady. I knew Helen for over 30 years, he said. She was one of the sharpest people I'd ever met. And in her final months, she was clear-headed and knew exactly what she wanted. She talked about Lucas often, how much he meant to her, and how proud she was of the man he'd become. My heart swelled, hearing those words. I hadn't realized how much my relationship with Aunt Helen had meant to her friends, too. Tom continued, speaking of Helen's pride and affection for me, describing the relationship we'd built over the years. Then he looked over at my father, his expression solemn. Aaron, you and Helen, you had your differences, and I know she didn't always see eye to eye with you. But that was her decision, her choice. You have to respect that. When Tom stepped down, the room was silent. Dad's lawyer seemed to scramble, unsure of how to respond to this unexpected testimony. It was clear that the court had seen a different side of Helen, a strong, decisive woman who'd made her own choices without influence from anyone. Finally, the judge asked if there was any last evidence or statements before she made her ruling. My dad's lawyer looked defeated, but my dad wasn't done yet. He stood up, requesting to make a final statement. I just want to say that this whole thing is heartbreaking, he began, his voice thick with emotion. I never wanted it to come to this, but I feel that my son has taken advantage of our family. He's young, and he doesn't understand the responsibilities that come with managing an estate. Helen would have wanted someone experienced, someone who knew her well. I can't stand by and watch him throw her legacy away. The judge watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she nodded, then looked over at me. Lucas, do you have anything to say? I stood up, my heart pounding, feeling the weight of everything that had happened over the past few months. Your Honor, I loved my aunt. She wasn't just a relative. She was a friend, a mentor. I never asked for any of this, and I certainly didn't manipulate her. I just want to honor her memory, to do right by her. This isn't about money or property for me. It's about respect for her and for the choices she made. The judge nodded, then called for a short recess to consider her decision. As she left the room, I sat back down, feeling emotionally drained. Dad wouldn't look at me, and I didn't know whether to feel relieved or sad. When the judge returned, everyone rose. She sat down, her face calm, and looked between my father and me before speaking. "This case has been a difficult one," she began. "It's clear that both parties have strong feelings and a complicated history with the deceased. However, the evidence presented has shown that Ms. Helen was of sound mind when she made her decision to leave her estate to Mr. Lucas." I felt a surge of hope, but I kept my face neutral, not daring to react. The judge continued, "The court finds no basis to suggest that Mr. Lucas unduly influenced Ms. Helen. Therefore, her will shall stand as written. Mr. Lucas, you are the rightful beneficiary of her estate." A wave of relief washed over me, but it was bittersweet. I glanced at my father, who looked stricken, his face pale with shock. It was as though he'd truly believed he could take this from me, that he'd had every right to tear apart Aunt Helen's wishes for his own gain. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I am compelled to issue a warning to Mr. Aaron. Contesting a will is a serious matter, and your baseless accusations against your son have caused significant emotional distress and financial hardship. In cases like this, the court has a duty to protect the integrity of the deceased's wishes and to discourage future, unfounded contests." With that, she banged her gavel, signaling the end of the case. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. I'd won, but at what cost? The father I'd once respected, once admired, had become a stranger to me, a man driven by greed, unable to see the damage he'd done. As we left the courtroom, Dad brushed past me without a word, his expression one of barely contained fury. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge me. I watched him walk away, feeling a pang of loss that cut deeper than I'd expected. But as I stepped out into the fresh air, I thought of Aunt Helen. I thought of her fierce independence, her love of life, and her unyielding loyalty to those she trusted. She'd left me her legacy because she believed in me, and despite everything, I knew I'd do my best to honor her wishes. The courtroom battle was over, but the emotional fallout lingered like a bruise. I'd won Aunt Helen's estate, honoring her final wishes, yet the victory felt strangely hollow. My father and I hadn't spoken since he stormed out, his silence as cold as the look he'd given me that day. I wanted to believe he'd eventually come around, that he'd see things from my perspective, but deep down, I knew better. The days that followed were quiet, almost surreal. I spent most of my time at Aunt Helen's house, going through her things and discovering pieces of her life that I'd never known. Every room held memories, her laughter, her wisdom, the way she'd look at me with a quiet pride whenever I'd tell her about my latest ambitions. She'd left behind notes, small reminders of her thoughts and plans, making me feel as though she were still there with me, guiding me through the storm her decision had unleashed. One afternoon, as I was organizing her papers, I found a letter addressed to me in her distinct, slanted handwriting. My heart pounded as I unfolded it, her words leaping off the page with a kind of clarity that made me feel her presence more vividly than ever. "Dear Lucas, if you're reading this, it means I've gone, and I'm so sorry for the chaos that my decision might have caused. I know your father well, and I know he's not one to give up easily. But remember this, I left this to you because I trust you. I see in you a kindness, a resilience, and a sense of responsibility that others might overlook. You have a chance to do something meaningful with what I've left you, to shape your own path. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You were and always will be enough." Her words brought a rush of relief, a validation I hadn't known I needed until that moment. Aunt Helen had foreseen all of it, the tension, my father's bitterness, even the doubts that had crept into my mind along the way. But her faith in me was unwavering, and I knew then that she'd intended this inheritance not just as a gift, but as a challenge. She wanted me to grow, to find my own strength, even if that meant breaking away from family expectations. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on. I invested in restoring Aunt Helen's house, making it my own while preserving her memory in every room. It became my sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe, away from the weight of my father's accusations and the relentless scrutiny of family drama. One evening, I received an unexpected call from Carol, Aunt Helen's best friend. She'd been a pillar of support throughout the entire ordeal, and her voice on the line felt like a reminder of the family I still had, even if it wasn't bound by blood. "Lucas," she said warmly, "I wanted to check on you. How's the house coming along?" "It's good, Carol," I replied, smiling. "I think Aunt Helen would be proud." She chuckled, and there was a hint of nostalgia in her tone. "Oh, I'm sure she would. She adored you, Lucas. And she was wise to trust you with all of this, no matter what anyone else says." I felt a pang of gratitude for her words. "Thanks, Carol. It means a lot to hear that." After we hung up, I sat in Aunt Helen's old armchair, looking around the room with a newfound sense of peace. I'd faced betrayal, anger, and the loss of the relationship I'd once had with my father, but through it all, I discovered a strength in myself that I hadn't known was there. As the evening light filled the room, I realized that I'd won more than an inheritance. I'd won the right to live my life on my own terms, without being defined by my father's expectations or anyone else's demands. Aunt Helen had given me more than just her estate. She'd given me a chance to define my own legacy, and for that, I'd be forever grateful.